as I was saying, there are three different approaches to studying fiction. There are many different approaches to studying fiction. These are the three that we are discussing. Historicist approach is the one which focuses on the history of the work and the writer. New criticism focuses on the text only, whereas reader response says that the reader is part of the interpretation as well. And I really believe in the reader response approach. I feel that your interpretations are equally important. You, as readers, should be allowed to interpret. And as long as you've read the text, your interpretation cannot be wrong. All right. So the way that you interpret it tells a lot about the text as well as you. Okay. So every interpretation is correct. There can be multiple interpretations according to me, as I believe in this reader response theory. So I really look forward to you engaging with the text yourself as well. Okay. New criticism is quite intellectual as well. New criticism says that you don't need to know about the history of the author or the age. You just need to rely completely on the text. The meaning is hidden in the text. So read that and try to create meaning from that. But the only problem that I have with new criticism is that they do not believe in many interpretations, the possibility of many interpretations, which is a more accepted norm now in literary studies. Okay. Now, why study Lord of the Flies? A lot of people ask these questions, and usually students don't really get an answer to why certain texts are included in the text. Students are not usually told an answer to that. So I just wanted to explain how texts are selected. All right, so why study Lord of the Flies? How are the novels selected in the curriculum? The Higher Education Commission gives us a list of novels that we are supposed to teach. So the curriculum is not designed in the department initially. It is designed by the Higher Education Commission. HEC decides which works should be included and which should not be included, right? But they gave us a very long list. It's not as precise as the 4 novels that you get in each semester. Then there is an academic council in the university and a board of studies in the department. They then decide what exactly should be the syllabus. Board of studies, after passing through the board of studies, we have a list of 10 novels. No, 12 novels, 6 in each semester that we teachers can choose from. So we just have very limited choice. Why are they selected? They're selected for their acclaim, their critical studies, inclusion in the syllabus of other universities. So we look at what is included in other universities as well, because then when you appear in general exams, you should be able to have the same syllabus as others. Why did I choose to teach this particular work? Lord of the Flies was not really taught before I taught fiction, because this was a part of my PhD. It has got themes of citizenship, so it talks about political themes. It talks about it's universally a very well-known work. Golding was a Nobel Prize winner, so it's really a very, very good work that has been taught in schools for a very long time all over the world. Yes, it is very philosophical. It talks about human nature in a very, very distinct way. William Golding, having experienced the World War recently before the novel, has talked about human nature in detail in this work. And we'll talk about it in detail in the coming classes. So this is why we are studying Lord of the Flies. Let's move on. What is the novel about? What do you know about the novel? Right. So here are some facts about Lord of the Flies. It was written in 1954 by Nobel laureate William Golding. It's a dystopian novel. What is a dystopia? It's the opposite of utopia. Utopia is the ideal world. Dystopia is a society that is undesirable or frightening. Okay. It's written in the aftermath of World War II. So Lord of the Flies presents a critique of democratic society. So one thing that we should know about Lord of the Flies is that it was written in response to a lot of island stories that were written before Lord of the Flies. Um, have you ever read Robinson Crusoe or The Treasure Island or any other island stories or island movies? Have you? There are a lot of novels where people get novels and movies where people get stranded on an island and then they try to make their life out of that. Life of Pi, yes, watched a lot of island movies. Okay, Life of Pi is one such example. Kuratalan has read Robinson Crusoe, so that's great. Okay, there was another one, The Coral Island. Okay, The Coral Island, written by Ballantyne, was a novel that Lord of the Flies is written in response to. So Coral Island is a happy novel. It's a utopian novel, and Lord of the Flies is completely opposite. People get stranded on the island, and they create a community there. They behave very well, and they find food, shelter. They do their duties, and everybody lives very happily. That's the Coral Island. So, having just experienced war, Golding was in a very pessimistic state of mind. So, he did not agree with the ideology of the Coral Island. He felt that if people were left alone, they would not behave like that, right? They would not behave very well. They would behave very adversely, and that is why he wrote Lord of the Flies. Okay. All right. Please go through the slide. Moving on. Um, the beginning of the novel is as expected. The boys gather, they choose a leader, they assign duties, and try to build their means of survival. Okay. Um, so it's like any island story, right? It starts with boys trying to make sense of where they are and going for basic means of survival. So they want some shelter, they want some food, they build a fire. It starts like any island novel. It's a very beautiful island. Nobody lives there. It's uninhabited, and it's very, very, very beautiful. Got coconut trees everywhere, a clean beach, and this as the story progresses, however, the natural evil within the kids starts taking over. So things start to change as the story progresses. People start forgetting what they needed to do. There are clashes over leadership, so who should be the chief of the tribe? And pleasures like hunting are pursued. And imagine these are just 6 to 12-year-old boys, right? They're very young, but they're hunting pigs and they're killing nursing sows. And the loyalties are divided, so they get divided into two groups. And eventually, some boys are even killed. They start killing each other. So, Lord of the Flies is a very grim, very dark, pessimistic novel which portrays how, in the absence of a democratic society, evil takes over everyone, even young boys. So, Golding is trying to show that human nature is instinctively evil. So, evil takes over everyone if there is no accountability, if there are no rules, if there are no laws, then there would be evil in everybody's nature. All right. So um, I had you looking, and then you've done it in history of English literature as well. What do you think was the condition of England in 1950s? What do we know about that? Comment on education, status of women, industrialization, whatever you know about. That's a picture of 1950s England. Probably York. What was happening in 1950s? So the World War had just finished. So obviously the English society must have been affected by that. People became very pessimistic. Yes, that's right. Was rejection of religion in that era because of the disillusionment of the war. Yes. Financial and economic crisis in England. Yes. Women were used as the workforce now due to the men being killed in the war. People started questioning their own identity. Movements like existentialism became common. So we know about certain features of that era. Let's take a look at the next slide, right? World War II had just happened. People had seen a lot of death, misery, um, dearth, like the lacking of food and basic necessities, and it had affected the way that they thought. Obviously, it had changed the way that they um, perceived the world. The effects of the war were visible. So there were vacant areas, there were bomb sites. People's fathers and grandfathers had served in the military. So everybody could still see the war around them. So you could actually see the war grounds, the bomb sites, where there had been missiles fallen and stuff like that. So people could see those things. Yes, Kashif, that's right. He's saying that he read somewhere that people stopped complaining for smaller things because they were tired of the war and fighting. Exactly. When you see so much death and misery, then I think your view of the world changes. A significant portion of the budget went to defense. So there were still heavy taxes on everything else, and there was a rationing on food. So you only got a specific amount for a specific number of people in the house. There was still that effect of the war on people's everyday life. It was a traditional Christian society. It was still a Christian society with a lot of taboos against rationalism. So even though the movements of existentialism and the revolt against religion had started in that time, but generally the whole society was Christian, and rationalism or disillusionment with God were not seen as good things in that society. It was still a taboo to talk about those issues. Further, Britain was the most industrialized and urbanized country at that time. In the whole of Europe, Britain was industrialized a lot. Like we saw in the image, there were cars that were common. People had started using a lot of machines in their daily lives, and industries were growing around major cities. So it was urbanized to a lot of extent. Coal was used everywhere, which caused smog and led to thousands of deaths. So many people lived in the cities, but most land of the country was still rural and agricultural. So most people's livelihood came from agriculture, farming. Most children went to secondary schools, so university education was very less common. All right. Only a few males from middle class who had previous education privately were able to go to universities. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge, King's College, those were running at that time as well, but not a lot of people attended university at that time, and definitely not a lot of women attended at that time. I was listening to a speech by someone in when it was my convocation at the University of York. Somebody was given an honorary degree, and she was saying that she went to Cambridge in 1960s, and she said she was one of very few women at the university at that time. So obviously in 1950s there would be lesser women in the universities. Women did not work after marriage mostly. After the war, they went back to their domestic duties, even though women were used as a workforce during the war. But that did not continue for most of them as they went back to their domestic duties. Obviously, at home, there were a lot of things to do at that time with large families, and somebody needed to tend to those duties as well. Use of some machines like those for washing and sewing were common. though there were still open fires and no refrigerators. So home life was still a bit difficult. There were still open fires, and there were no fridges in the country. But some machines had started coming to the household. Okay. All right, let's discuss what we know about William Golding. All right, so Sir William Gerald Golding, that's his full name. He was awarded the title of Sir by, he was knighted, and he received the title. He was a Nobel laureate. He was born in Cornwall, UK, and he died in 1993. He studied science at Oxford and later changed to literature. He was told to choose science based on his father's insistence and the later one of his own accord. How many of you are in literature due to your father's choices? Fathers tend to have a lot of influence in our choices. Moving on, when he was a student, he got his first collection of poems published. He always dreamt of being a poet rather than a novelist. Okay, he wrote a number of novels in his life, 12 to be exact, of which Lord of the Flies is his debut, like we were told earlier, and is considered his masterpiece. He was knighted. He was given the title of Sir, and it was because he had a very good reputation, and the royal family could give those titles to people of repute. Okay. Golding was interested in theater and poetry from a very young age. He worked in the theater himself and considered Greek tragedies and Shakespeare a greater influence on him than any novelist. Right? His mother was a supporter of the British suffrage. Suffrage is women's political right to vote. Okay? So his mother was a supporter of that. His father was a school teacher who believed in rationalism, logic rather than emotion or spirituality. Golding worked as a school teacher. So this book, Lord of the Flies, is about a group of boys at school. So Golding based it on his personal experience. He was a school teacher for most of his life until he retired for full-time writing in 1961. So this might be one of the reasons he chose to write about a group of boys. And he taught in an all boys school in Cornwall, where he was born and where he lived. Golding was afraid of the dark as a child. Carrie, 2012, who is his biographer, she cites his mother as a negative influence on his life. Carrie says that Golding's mother was very violent with him, and she used to throw things at him multiple times, and she would never hug him, and she avoided all form of physical contact with her son, and told him horror stories as a child. So that kind of had a very negative impact on his mind. And some people argue that that is why he has written such a pessimistic novel, or that is why there are no women in the novel. So that's arguable. Golding worked in the Navy. Everybody was required to work in the Navy during the World War, and Golding worked there for 5 years as well, which obviously affected his work, especially Lord of the Flies, a lot. And that's not just me saying it, McCarran also says the same thing. Let's discuss what happens in the first chapter. How did the chubby boy introduce himself, and what does the conch represent? All right, so what happens in the first chapter is that there are a group of English schoolboys who land on an island, and they're trying to create civilization by holding meetings and holding elections. A hint is given about the World War. We don't know what's going on in the background, but we just know that their plane crashed and there is a bomb in the background. That's it. The conch is used to call everyone, and it becomes a symbol of civilization. Some people say it's the symbol of democracy. Some people say it's the symbol of civilization. It kind of represented that rule of law, right? Moving on. So, story of the first chapter, the text that's written in brown is the actual text from the chapter. A group of young boys find themselves isolated on an island. They start to form groups and find a leader amongst them. There are some big boys and some little ones. I would ask you to please read the brown text on the slide so that we can move on to the next one. So they're talking about the pilot, and they're saying that we were attacked. And if you notice, Piggy's way of talking is not very standard English. We was attacked. When we was coming down, I looked through one of them windows. I saw the other part of the plane. There were flames coming out of it. So there's a plane, and there was an attack. So it feels like there is some bad thing going on outside world. Please continue reading. Piggy is very worried that everybody is dead and nobody knows that we are alone here. However, Rolf doesn't seem to be listening to him. He just keeps saying things that that interest him rather than listening to Piggy, right? Piggy is very worried and his lips are quivering, his spectacles are dimmed with mist, so it feels like he's about to cry or he's crying, and he's worried that we may stay here till we die. Moving on to the next one. This basically is the only mention of a female in the whole novel. My auntie wouldn't let me on account of my asthma. That's the only woman that is mentioned throughout the novel. Nowhere else is any woman mentioned. They talk about their dads, but nobody talks about their mother. Piggy is the only one who talked about his aunt just once in the novel, and that's it. So they found this conch and they're using it to call everybody else. But Piggy, even though he's the one who found the conch, he tells Rolf to blow the conch and call the others. He says, on account of my asthma, I cannot blow it myself. Okay, so what happens next is that the boys start calling each other with the help of the conch. Yeah, it's a bit difficult to identify who said what, but you can recognize what Piggy said by his weird English. That always helps. So the boys start calling each other with the help of the conch. Once they all gather, they hold a meeting to decide what to do and who to select as their leader. We are introduced to the choir boys of Jack Married You. So Jack is the other important character. So on the one side, we'll have Rolf, and on the other, we'll have Jack. We see that Jack is very disciplined and he keeps his choir boys. Choir is a kind of song that they sing in the church. So they are a group of boys who sing in the choir, and Jack kind of leads them, right? So Jack always keeps them very disciplined. So the group of cloaked boys begin to scatter from clothesline. The tall boy shouted at them, "Choir, stand still." Verily obedient, the choir huddled into the line and stood there swaying in the sand. Nonetheless, some began to protest faintly. So even though they were standing in the sun, they were not protesting very loudly. They were protesting very faintly. All right, moving on. They decide to have a vote and select a chief. Somebody says, let's vote. And Golding calls it this toy of voting was almost as pleasing as the conch. So he's kind of being sarcastic that they are voting, but it's really like a toy. It's funny. It's almost like they're playing with the idea of democracy, right? Jack started to protest, but the clamor changed from the general wish for a chief to an election by a claim of Rolf himself. Him with the shell, Rolf, everybody starts saying that. Let him be the chief with the trumpet thing. Rolf raised a hand for silence. All right, who wants Jack for chief? With dreary obedience, the choir raised their hands. Who wants me? Every hand outside the choir, except Piggy's, was raised immediately. Then Piggy too raised his hand grudgingly into the air. Rolf counted, I am chief then. So this was kind of a mock election that they held to find out who wants to be the leader. They didn't really ask Piggy, and Piggy was a bit conscious of the fact that everybody was voting for Rolf, and nobody really asked him. But there was a lot of peer pressure, and he obediently. Okay, it was Rolf who said for Roger who said for voting. Rolf was selected as a leader. We don't really know Rolf that much. Neither did everybody else. So they just saw this boy standing on a rock with a conch in his hand, with the shell which was used to call everybody in his hand. So nobody really knew Rolf very much, and it's very parallel to how we select our leaders. We don't really know much about our leaders when we go to vote. Most of us, we just base it on the way they look, the way they speak, or some very superficial features. And that's exactly what these young boys did. They selected the leader based on his looks, and they didn't know much else about him. So Jack and his choir boys decide to be a group of hunters. They say that they are going to hunt for food, and a few boys go out to check if it is an island, and they come to know that it is one with no signs of civilization. Okay. So that's all about chapter 1. These are